Hello, community, and welcome back to another Keeping It Real with Dr. Anita podcast. I am your host, Dr. Anita Polite Wilson, C-suite trusted advisor, elite team strategist, and board director, preparing organizations to navigate culture, complexity, and change. And I'm delighted to have back on this real conversation from the C-suite, Ms. Britt Hogue, the founder and CEO of The Collective Good. Britt, thank you so much for coming back for another conversation.
Thanks for having me back.
So we've been talking about the evolution of DEI, perhaps needing to change the language to make it comfortable for folks to still engage and yet still do the work. I have been using the little analogy of putting your vitamins inside a spoonful of sweet potatoes if that's the way we need to get you to take it down, but we're going to have to continue to do the work. And as always, at least from my perspective, we must always meet people where they are. And to be careful that we're not just delivering a message that we think is right, but to deliver a message that can be received in a way that people can internalize the message and come to the realization of the rightness of that message as they're able to do so during their reflections. That's always been my approach. So that being the case, can the mission behind DEI be effective when some people have a negative view of the concept?
Well, if we start from a place of the work has to continue, so we have to figure out how to keep it moving forward. And I love your analogy of, how do we have to help the medicine go down? Is trying to understand why folks have a negative connotation. What's negative about DEI? So I try to lead from a place of curiosity.
Yes.
When someone's saying, oh, there's DEI again, or that was a DEI hire, I say, well, what's wrong with that? Like, well, can you help me understand what you mean by that? And often you'll hear kind of, well, it's woke, and it's, more platitudes, more kind of broad sweeping statements.
Right.
And you can say, well, tell me more about that. Like, what's,
right.
That's
just what I was thinking. Yeah. So what does woke mean? Right.
All the time. It's like, well, why? Okay, well then why? I think, but what you're doing is you're really inviting a conversation, and you're trying to kind of meet them where they are and say, I want to understand where you're coming from so that we can discuss, and maybe I'll learn something, and maybe I'll have something to say where you'll learn something.
Right. Speaking of woke, I actually wrote a book that talks about the origins of the term woke and that it has been misappropriated like so many other things meant for good. And we need to understand what it is that we're talking about instead of repeating a concept that we believe without necessarily understanding the origins of it. So community, you might want to just look up the word woke and the origins of it as it has been related to this work. My next question for you, Britt, is it time to retire the term DEI because of the negative connotation that it has? You have already mentioned culture. I know that I'm using culture a lot more in my work. I agree with you that it's always been about the culture, but sometimes you need to call out specificity in the culture that you want to address. So what do you think about changing the term altogether?
Right. I do think you have to know your audience, right? And I think where you can stay on the message and use the words, I think we continue to use the words. I don't want to abandon them just because there's pressure over there. I still think these are the right words, so let's use them. However, if you're in a situation where, for some reason there are some pressures, there's pushback, there's something that's going to get in the way of moving the work forward if we continue to use these words. So for example, we do some work with health departments. And some of the organizations that we work with say, we can't do it if the word race is on there.
Yeah.
We're in a state where we can't say it. But we want to, right? The team is saying, but we still want to move the work forward. Will you help us? And I said, sure, we don't have to call it DEI. Let's call it culture. Let's call it wellness. Let's call it psychological safety. Let's call it just anything, showing up and doing your work, your best work. We can call it a lot of things that actually get to the heart of what it is that we're talking about. Just getting under the words is what's more important. So I think if you have to rebrand it to keep the work going forward, I think that's a trade-off worth making.
It's a conversation I've been having with my other colleagues who are practitioners in the work. Do we stay with the term? Do we not? Do we look like it's the flavor of the month? Do we look like we're no longer dedicated? When you speak to your colleagues, what's the sense? What is the sentiment around sticking with DEI and doing the work, or calling it culture and doing the work?
It's a pretty mixed bag. We work with folks who are, unapologetically about racial equity. And they say, if you can't say racial equity is what you're doing, then we don't want to work with you.
Yep.
And, and I think, and that's fine. That's their choice. Then there are organizations that are more like ours that say, I would like to help this group move forward in some way. They're asking for help. And there are some constraints. So we can't use the words that we would like to use, but everyone in the room knows what we're doing here. And so we'll play the game a little bit in order to just keep the game going, as opposed to bringing it to a complete halt. So I think organizations have to make that decision for themselves, whether you're supporting other organizations or it's within the walls of your organization, and you can either push back to say, no, actually, my division is going to keep calling it DEI, and you're willing and able to kind of fight that battle. Or if you're in a position where you say, this is not the battle that I want to fight, I'll call it something else for the sake of continuing the book.
I'm curious to know what percentage of your existing client base or potential client base has said to you, we can't necessarily use the words, but we do still want to do the work.
It's less than half. So it's thankfully not the majority of our clients that are saying we kind of have to take a stealthy approach to this. But there are a few. I'd say probably around 25 to 30% have said we can't. We have to call it something else. And I would say, actually, one of the things I'm thinking about as I'm even answering this is, I think there's also another category that's close to that category that says, that are kind of questioning. They themselves are saying, well, should we be doing this? We understood it before which again, another opportunity to say, okay, well, let's have some conversations where we break it down, because I want to know if you are actually committed to doing the work. And if you're not sure anymore, then, let's just agree that it's time to stop the work. But if you want to have a conversation where we're actually trying to get to, is woke a bad thing? I'm not sure anymore. I've heard it so many times being used as a negative that now we're kind of wondering, should we spend some time unpacking it? Well, that, I'd love to have that conversation. I want to be a part of that. I hope you'll come out of the other side understanding that, being awakened is not a bad thing. It's enlightenment is a good thing. But if you're not, then that's okay too.
It's interesting that you use the word awakened, because I did a podcast where I talked about what bothers us about being woke is not necessarily being woke, but how it's been done, whether we've been gently nudged or whether we've been hit on the head. That makes a difference as to how we accept being awakened about something. So I find it interesting that you would use that word. I'm so disappointed that we've only got one conversation left, but I am excited for it. So community, please come back to our final conversation with Ms. Britt Hogue, the founder and CEO of The Collective Good. And in that conversation, we're going to talk about, again, DEI and team culture. If anything that we've said today has sparked something in you, please share it with your network along with your own comments. And in the meantime, stay in the flow, follow, like, and overshare any conversation here amongst our real conversations from the C-suite that helps you to reframe hot topic conversations from difficult to different. Until next time, this is Dr. Anita reminding you to stay blessed and keep it real.